Bueno, ahora sí ya estamos listos para comenzar. Nuevamente, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta charla que seguramente va a ser muy interesante. Y antes de cederle la palabra a Matt, me gustaría presentarlo muy brevemente para quienes no lo conocen o no conocen acerca de su trayectoria profesional. Matt Friedman es un experto en temas de desarrollo internacional que cuenta con más de 30 años de experiencia. Actualmente es el CEO del Mekong Club, que es una organización que asesora al sector privado para que sea quien lidere la lucha contra la trata de personas en Asia. El señor Friedman ha trabajado en más de 30 países para la Agencia de Desarrollo Internacional del Gobierno de Estados Unidos, así como también para Naciones Unidas. Ha sido asesor de jefes de gobierno, bancos y empresas y también es autor de 12 libros. En el 2017, Matt recibió el premio de oro al comunicador del año en Asia por dar más de 800 presentaciones a 80,000 personas, incluidos jefes de Estado y el Vaticano, en un periodo de 5 años en diferentes países. Matt tiene un estilo único y poderoso que inspira a las personas y las ayuda a alcanzar su máximo potencial. Matt, it is our pleasure that you have accepted our invite. We're so happy and excited. Thank you so much for being with us. As you know, you're gonna have this presentation, and at the end, we're gonna have a slot for Q&A. So just give me a few seconds so I can tell the audience how this is gonna work. Thank you. La presentación de Matt será en inglés. Al final de la presentación tendrán un espacio para preguntas. Las preguntas las pueden enviar en el chat en español, no hay ningún problema y nosotros haremos la traducción al inglés. Asimismo, si hay algo que no les quede claro por el tema del idioma, cuando este video lo subamos a nuestras redes, tendrá la traducción para que cualquier duda que les quede, ahí la puedan clarificar. Muchas gracias. Y Matt, we're ready. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Indira, for an opportunity for me to be here today. I only wish I had more than 7th grade Spanish. My apologies for not being able to communicate in many of your languages. To begin with, just to talk a little bit more about my background and to explain why I do talks like this, I have been working in the developmental sector for about 30 years. I worked for the US government as a diplomat. I worked in the United Nations. I now run an organization that focuses on human trafficking, working with the private sector. So as part of this process, I have to do a lot of public speaking. And as part of doing public speaking, I come to realize that there are certain techniques and approaches that communicate a message better than others. So what I'm going to do quickly through this presentation is just to describe a little bit about my experience over the years and the reason why I think that storytelling is the more effective way of addressing our talks. Keep in mind that my particular sector, my area of expertise is related to the issue of human trafficking. So these are the stories that I'll be telling, but I want to emphasize, and this is very important, that this approach and these techniques can be used in any sector. It can be in regular business, it can be in a charity, it can be in an academic situation. So with that, let me get started by basically giving some examples of stories and helping to articulate why I think it's important by contrasting two approaches. The first approach is this. How many times have we been in a presentation where you have a slide deck that has 30 slides and each of them looks something like this. There is a heading on the top, and there are a bunch of points that are being made related to a particular topic. So when I was working for the United Nations, this would be a typical slide. And let me describe how I would present this slide. So I'm going to go into a role model mode, which means that I will present as if I'm presenting, and I will do this throughout the presentation. So here's what I would say. Sex trafficking in Nepal takes place by girls in remote villages that basically are impoverished. Many of them are somewhat desperate, and as a result of that, they're vulnerable for human trafficking. The traffickers themselves tend to be people from India, a guy around 20 years old. He would go into the village and he would recruit these girls. Many of them are tricked, and after they're tricked, they end up going into India. The ages range from something like 12 to 14 years old. Many of them are physically and sexually abused as part of the process. Some of them get HIV/AIDS along the way. Some of them, after the experience, make it home. Many don't. So we've all heard these types of presentations. It's the standard way that people present. But the difficulty that I have with this is what you have are a series of factual statements that are offered to provide information, but these factual statements are not connected. They are a series of just points that, as a result of presenting them in this way, are not very memorable because the connection isn't there. And how many of us have sat through presentations after the fourth or fifth or sixth slide, it gets a little bit tedious, it gets a little bit boring, and we begin to tune out. So to contrast this particular type of approach, what I'm going to do is to offer an alternative to show the same type of information can be presented in the form of a story, which changes the way a person accepts this information. So let me then go into role-playing mode. I'm going to present as if I was presenting. When most people think about human trafficking, this is what they think of, this photo you see. Forced prostitution. For good reason. There are 4.2 million women and girls in forced prostitution. My first exposure to this was about 30 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and it was my job to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls who were HIV positive who were 12, 13 years old. Now, if you know anything about Nepal, you know it's a very conservative culture. We should not have found that disease among that age group. So we went to go and interview them. And what we heard was basically the same story over and over again. And the story went something like this. A human trafficker, a guy around 20 years old, would go into the village, flash a bunch of money around to show he was rich, and then he'd go and say, I'm looking for a wife. I don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. He'd find a girl, 12, 13 years old, become friends with her, and then go to the family and say, I want to marry your daughter. The family's thinking, wow, she's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us, everybody's happy. 2 days later, they actually have a wedding ceremony. The entire community is there. After this, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead of taking her to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where prostitution takes place. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here, I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw all these men and women milling around, these women in these weird clothes. She says, no, don't leave me. I'm frightened. He says, it's okay, you just stay here. He then goes off to the madam who runs the brothel. He gets the $600 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding and he hands the wedding picture to her. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 15 guys a day, every day, because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, 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 no. My husband loves me. No, that's what happens. When she comes to internalize this, many of the girls say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then takes out the photograph of the family from the wedding and says, is this your mother, your father, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. To make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they'll rape this 12-year-old girl 30 times until she eventually just lays back, accepts whatever happens to her, and then she's put on the line, which means that she will be with 15 guys a day, maybe 20 every day, until after a couple of years where she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically, emotionally, and spiritually that she's thrown out onto the street. If she's lucky, she gets back to Nepal. Many times she doesn't. Okay, let me get out of my role now. So what I do is I present a photograph and I tell a story based on the photograph. And the reason why I do it this way, as opposed to those bullets, is number one, it's touching. It's a very emotional type story. A second thing is, because I'm using a storytelling style, it's relatable. People understand stories. When we go home to our spouses and we tell them what happened during the day, we tell it in the form of a story. That's the way we communicate with each other, not through bullets and factual information. As the story is going on, it raises expectations. We're thinking, what's going to happen next? What is going to happen with this girl? How is this going to play out? And although using the word entertain may seem funny in this situation, because it's drama, it's kind of like watching TV or a movie. We are drawn into it because we're thinking about the characters and the way these things play out. So this use of stories at the beginning of a talk, and it doesn't matter what it is your talk is, it can be anything. It can be a small company that's setting up something and trying to get a point across. In my particular case, it happens to be a little bit emotional, but any kind of story can be used. Okay, so after I've done this particular element of the story, I go a little bit deeper beyond this. And so let me get back into role playing. So while I was hearing these stories of these 12-year-old girls on a regular basis, I didn't understand the sheer evil of this problem until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks in Mumbai, in the brothels. I went there, I had a police officer with me, and I would go from brothel to see if they were using safe sex and condoms and so forth. I went to one brothel and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. Now this girl saw me, saw an opportunity, literally ran up to me, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, wearing a dress literally 20 sizes too big because she was a child in an adult's world. I turned to the police officer and I said, we need to get her out of here. He looked back at me and said, we can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? You're a cop. He said, if we try to take her out, we'll both get killed. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grew up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be one. But over and over and over again, I was faced with this situation where the problem was right in front of me. And in this particular case, it was a test. I was supposed to get that girl out of here. I failed miserably. After that, I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares. And I eventually did what a lot of activists do, is I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, I can't turn my back on it. And I became an activist, and 30 years later, here I am talking to you. So what I did in this is I described not a success, which we always feel like we have to talk about, but a failure. And I do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a deeply personal story, and it's related to my own personal experience. But by me trusting the audience with a failure, they begin to trust me. They realize that I'm honest. They realize that I'm credible. They realize that what I'm doing is there for the purpose of really conveying some meaning through the talk that I'm about to do. So if I start off with a talk like this, usually what you see is in the first minute or so, people are still looking at their phones. They're still milling around, maybe talking to somebody. 3 minutes into this, you'll see probably 40% of them looking and listening. By the end of these two stories, I have the attention of 100% of the people. They are listening, they want to know what's going to happen, and it's a very effective way of communicating. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to describe something else, a program element. So I worked in Bangladesh for 5 years, and during the time that I was there, I funded organizations that would do what's called safe migration training. This training, what it basically does is helps migrants to protect themselves so they don't get caught in human trafficking. Once again, if I was doing an ordinary presentation, it would have the name of the program on top and 10 or 12 bullets, and I would go through the factual information. Well, what I'm going to do this time is to tell this program story through using a story. So let me get into role model now. So years ago, when I was working in Bangladesh, I oversaw a safe migration portfolio. One day, one of my partners came to me and said, Matt, we're doing this training in a village. We're going to go and tell migrants about the issue of how to protect themselves from migration. Are you interested in attending? Well, you know, I always love to go out into the field. I immediately accepted, but I said, listen, let's do something. At the beginning of the training, before the training, do a pre-test to see what people know. Then you do your training, and then we'll do a post-test. I want to be able to go and say, I saw this, and you can't believe how much impact there was. So we went to the site. It was about a 2-hour drive. We did the pre-test. The people who were doing the presentation did about a 3-hour presentation. They did the post-test, but to our surprise, the scores didn't go up. They actually went down. So we talked to a bunch of people, and what we came to realize was there was way too much information. It confused the people, and as a result of that, a lot of the people who were sitting in the audience walked away less educated than they were before. So as we started to think about this, we asked the question, would it be possible to come up with one message, a very clear message for a community that we could teach people on? So I went and I hired an advertising agency. That ad agency sent their people into the villages for about 3 weeks. They did focus groups, they talked to people, they collected information. Then afterwards, they came back and said, we have a solution to this problem. We have a single thing that you can tell the villagers to protect them. Now, very seldom do you have these kind of silver bullets, but this was one of them. So they said, this is the situation. A trafficker comes into a community, says, if your son or daughter comes with me, they're going to make tremendous amounts of money. Your family is going to be doing so well. Everything's going to be great. It may sound too good to be true, but they can't say no to it because if it is true, it's so wonderful. And so what this group said to us is to say, if a trafficker comes in and they say that they want to take the son or daughter, the family is told to say yes, but to add one more thing, that a family member will go with that person to the site to make sure they get settled. If this is a real situation, there's no problem. The person recruiting them wouldn't care. If it's not, it will end. The opportunity will evaporate. So we went into a couple of communities and we taught them that one thing, nothing more. We went back 6 months, and what happened is the villagers came and said, aha, you were right. About 60% of the times when we tell them that we want to send the family member, it disappears. So we know there was a problem associated with it. So now we understand what you were saying. So as all of us were growing up, We were told not to take candy from strangers. We were told not to get into strangers' cars. Everybody reinforced that. This message that I just described became a part of the community, just like that. Everyone reinforced the fact that if a family member can't go along, it could be trafficking, and this is what we will do. So I would end this story here. And I use this particular type of story because it gives the rationale and the understanding of what we started with, what didn't work, the approach we used in order to fix it, and then we ended with a positive outcome. So we feel that as you're presenting things, it's important to feel like you can talk about your failures and then to explain how your failures were translated into opportunities. And so this particular approach can be highly effective at really helping people to understand a program without being at a tedious list of just bullets. I often use storytelling to bring the audience into the discussion, to include them in the message. So here's a story that I tell based on the banking world. I'll get into role play now. So about 2 years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., presenting at a banking conference. After the presentation was over, this guy comes running up to me and says, "Matt, I want to talk to you." This happens often at presentations. And so I went off to the side with this person, and he said, "I want to tell you a story. A year ago, I was going from one side of the United States to another with my 2 teenage daughters and my wife. We drove about halfway there, decided to stop in a motel. I got my family settled and I was going out for food. But as I was leaving, I saw this 14-year-old girl being dragged into a room. Clearly, she was involved in something related to prostitution. He was an aggressive person. Because I had teenage daughters, I was really bothered by this. And so I went to the office manager to report this. I didn't know if anything would happen, but sure enough, what happened was about 20 minutes later, the police showed up. They went to the door of this guy, knocked on it, and 20 minutes later, this guy was being taken out in handcuffs. And the girl was being taken away in another car, an unmarked car, I assume to a shelter. I wanted to tell you this story because this was a highlight in my life, a milestone. I felt so good about this. And I just wanted to tell you my story. So I turned to this guy and I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, I'm a banker." I said, "I get that. You're at a banking conference, but what do you do within the banking world?" He says, "I do risk assessment. I look at fraud cases, anti-money laundering cases, corruption cases." So I turned to him and I said, "Do you ever do cases related to human trafficking where you kind of look into this and research it?" He says, "Yeah, all the time." So I looked at this guy and I said, "Dude, you do this type of work every single day when you do your job. You find these cases, you write a suspicious transaction report, you submit it to the authorities. You may not see it the same way you saw that particular case, but what you do in your life and in your work is heroic. You're a hero." Now, I was really surprised that this person didn't make the connection between what he did and the fact that it helped people. So a couple of weeks after this conference, I was in Singapore and I was in front of 650 bankers from Singapore, and I told this story. And afterwards, I had a bunch of bankers come up to me and say, "Wow, nobody ever really gave us a pat on the back and supported the fact that what we were doing is relevant and important. We didn't make the connection. Thank you for helping us to see that." So as part of this story, what I was able to do was to talk about the audience, to congratulate the audience, to say to the audience, "You guys are heroes. You guys are people who make a difference. You are people who care." And as a result of using this particular story approach, a lot of people feel good at the end. They feel hopeful. They feel like what they're doing adds value and contributes to the process. So the way I develop messages is in a presentation that's 60 minutes, I would have at least 4 stories or more. And I would sit down and think to myself, what's the message I want to convey? By the end of the story, what do I want people to understand? And so that's the first thing I do is I want to make sure that the message is relevant to what I'm presenting. The second thing I do is I write the story down. I write all of the various sentences and characteristics. I cross things out, I add things, and I get it to a point where it's about 3 or 4 minutes long, no more than that. Anything that doesn't seem like it's relevant, I take out, and I try to make it very clear. The next thing I do is I test the story. I will go to my spouse, I will go to my friends, I will go to my colleagues and say, I'm going to tell you a story. What do you guys think? And they'll come back and say, well, you know, I like the story, or I thought it was too long, or you didn't need to mention this, or you got it right. After that, the next thing I do is I will try the story on a small audience. So I don't start with 100 people in a room. I'll start with maybe a meeting that I'm at or a small presentation, 8, 10 people. And then I do it several times in order to make sure that I get it right. But the important part of all of this is that I practice, practice, practice. It's really important not to try to tell a story for the first time if you've never told it before, because you end up adding things and going back and saying, oh, well, I forgot this, now I want to add this, and it becomes a little bit cumbersome as a result of that. The next topic I want to talk about is what's called conceptual clarity. So in the work that I do, for years, what I would do is talk about the human trafficking sector, the fact that there are 40 million people in modern slavery. There are more slaves than any other time in history. I would talk about how there were 9.2 million people who enter per year. I would talk about 25,000 enter per day, or new slave every 4 seconds. And I would go on with these statistics, and it would be showing the big picture and how there are so many people involved. But eventually I would get to a point where I would then admit that with all of the United Nations, NGO, and government people working together, we're only helping 0.2% of the victims. But what people were hearing were just numbers, 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 numbers. So what I started to do is, before I would tell these numbers, I would always give a story. And let me give you a typical story. So in Thailand, 15-year-old boy is told by his family that he has to raise money and send it home. So this Cambodia, this Cambodian boy is told he has to go to Thailand, get a job, and then send the money back. And so he'd go there, he'd be looking around for work, not finding it. Human traffickers in those communities would see this, go up to the boy and say, hey, listen, looks like you're looking for work, looks like you need some help. Let me lend you a little bit of money. Okay, well, now that you have my money, you know, you have to basically stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on the boat. The boat will go out for a couple of months. You're a guy. Guys love fishing, right? You catch some fish. The boat will come back. They'll give you a bunch of money. Life is going to be great. So they go down to the ocean. He gets on the boat. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor guy will work 14, 15, 16 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he will eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. He will be given drugs to stimulate him, to basically get him to work. If he gets ill, if he gets injured, he gets thrown off the boat. So this is the type of story that I would tell. And then I would say after that, imagine the fact that there are 40 million people in this situation. But by starting off with a story, what I'm doing is I'm giving a face to the numbers that I'm providing. I'm giving statistics to the numbers I'm providing. And it helps people to take those numbers and personalize it. In the environmental movement, we can see a similar type situation where instead of talking about the ocean of plastic that's out there in the real world, what we do is we show something like this to talk about a turtle that is affected by the pollution in the impact that this has on a single individual, in this particular case, a turtle. So what we try to do is to take huge issues that are abstract, that have many different components associated with it, and to personalize it and to make it have a face. And that particular approach allows us to really get points across that we're trying to get across. Another thing that I try to do is to offer definitions by not having, again, a list of points. In the human trafficking sector, we have what's called the Palermo Protocol. It has many different components associated with it. It's very complex. And so what we have is a situation where what I try to do is to, instead of going through those various points, I try to tell a story to get a point to really get across what it is that we're trying to do related to human trafficking. What's the real definition associated with this? So what you see here is an example of something that has the various components associated with it. It's too diverse, it's not memorable, and so let me give you a story version of this. And I'm going to get into the role playing now. So years ago, when I was living and working in Nepal, I knew a lot more about human trafficking than most people. And what would happen is United Nations people would come to me and say, Matt, we really want to learn about human trafficking. Can you teach us what it is that you know related to this topic? So at that particular time, I was extremely busy. I really didn't have time to do this, but they kept pestering me over and over again. So I decided that I would finally help them. So I went to them and I said, tell me what it is that you want to learn. And they said, well, we really want to understand what is human trafficking? How does it work? So I said, can I do anything to get this point across? And they said, we don't care as long as we understand the essence of it afterwards. And so I said, is the United Nations open on Saturday? They said, no. I said, can we use it? They said, yes. And I'd been to that building many, many times, so I understood what that building was like. And so on Saturday morning, we went to the United Nations, and there was a storage room off to the side. And I said, I need to get something in this storage room. So the three of them went there. They went into the room. I pulled the door shut, I locked it, and I left. For 3 hours, I went and I made a few phone calls. I went across the street to the cafeteria and I had some food. And I just kind of milled around. Keep in mind, this was before cell phones. So these guys had no way of getting out or communicating with anything. And then 3 hours later, I went to the door. They were kicking and screaming. I opened it up and I said, now you understand what human trafficking is. For 3 hours, I owned you. I determined whether you would be in there or not be in there. I determined how long you would be kind of stuck in that particular room. Now you understand the essence of the problem. You lose freedom when you're in human trafficking. Now, I wouldn't recommend going to this extreme. I got into a lot of trouble for doing this, but interestingly, this group of people came to me afterwards, years later, and said that was a very powerful message. I understood what human trafficking was because of what you did. So out of character now, I tell this story because instead of going through that list of bullets, I'm able to convey the meaning of what is human trafficking by telling this story. People understand that they lose control, that they don't have freedom, that they can't do the things that they want to do because I take control. It's a very effective way of getting the points across. So that basically gives you an overview of some of the storytelling techniques. And despite what people think, you can come up with a story for just about every aspect of your work, even if it doesn't have the same emotional kind of sentiment as the stories that I'm telling as I go through this presentation. So this next thing I want to do is to talk a little bit about how I tell stories, okay? And how you tell stories is as important as what you say. So I'm going to tell you a story now, and I want you to stop and listen to the pauses that I use in this story. Now, a lot of people feel like when they're doing public speaking that it has to be continuous talking. There can't be a break. But in reality, good public speaking has just the opposite. And sometimes I use pauses that are a little bit longer than what you would expect, and I'll explain the reason why I do that. So let me tell you this story and listen to the way I present it. So years ago, when I was living and working in Bangladesh, we were finding infants, 2-year-old boys that were being trafficked from Bangladesh to the Middle East. Now imagine this, 2-year-old boys, infants. Now, those of you who are parents might ask, what do you do with a 2-year-old boy? They don't have the manual dexterity or the concentration to do repetitive work. What would you do with them? You'd put them on the back of a camel. Why? Because if you put an infant on the back of a camel, what do? They kick and scream. And what does the camel do? It runs. So they put infants on the back of camels because they are light and they don't slow the camel down. And they race these camels and bet on them. So assuming that this 2-year-old child lives to, let's say, 5 years old and doesn't fall off and get trampled, many of them are beginning to gain weight. They're slowing the camel down. So what do they do with them? They throw them out onto the street. So at a time when most 5-year-old boys are beginning their education, kindergarten, somewhere in the world, you have a 5-year-old boy by himself, fending for himself, doesn't speak the language in a foreign country. You can imagine what kind of life that child will have. Not a very good one. So what I did here is I paused. And the reason why I pause is because it allows for the audience to think about and catch up with what I'm saying, to have some mental energy, to be analyzing the context as part of the process. I also use very simple language in order to convey this story. It doesn't have to be complicated. The more simple, the better. And so in this particular case, because I'm trying to sensitize people to the issue, it's relevant context. This story is relevant to what I'm trying to get across. Because it's in a story format, it's memorable. People will remember this particular story because everything was connected. It's interesting. We want to know what's going to happen with this infant. What does the camel have to do with this? What's going to happen at the end of this? And because I'm going to make points later on relevant to this story, it's a worthy message. So this is how story characteristics work. Another format that I use is I often bring the audience into the story. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Indira to come online for a moment. Indira, can I see you?
Sure.
Okay. So Indira, I'm going to offer you a job. So in this context, I have an audience in front of me. I pick a particular person. I say, I'm going to offer you a job. So Indira, sorry, I am going to offer you $1 million a year. You only have to work 4 days a week. I'll give you 2 hours off for lunch. I'll give you a house, a car, 3 months of vacation, and you can live anywhere in the world you want. Are you interested in that job?
Yes.
Were you thinking maybe it sounds too good to be true?
Right.
Well, it is, because I would take that job if it existed. So imagine if you're a person and you never made more than $2 a day, and much of the world is in that type of situation, and somebody comes up to that person and says, I'll give you $4 a day. And instead of working 16 and a half hours, you only have to work 15 hours. And guess what? I'll give you 2 hours off on Sunday, but you have to make the decision right now. Can't go home and talk. You make the decision. I'm going to go to that person or that person or that person. So the person can't say no, because even though in the back of their mind, they're thinking it may sound too good to be true, but what if it isn't? What if it's that one time in my life when I get a break, I'm going to get that motorcycle, I'm going to be able to get that tin roof, and so they say yes, and they get taken away. So about 85% of what we're talking about here is deceptions and lies. I'll give you another role-playing element here. So Indira, you're in Hong Kong and you have a family member that's sick, you need 1,000 Hong Kong dollars to help this person. You can't get it from anyone else. You come to me as a loan shark and I give you that $1,000. You then go and the operation takes place and the person gets helped and everyone's kind of doing great. After that, you come back a couple of days, very grateful, and try to give me 1,500 back. 1,500? I need 15,000. Well, you may say that that's not fair. I'm a criminal. I don't have to be fair. We didn't talk about the arrangements. You give me 15,000, or that same family member is going to get into trouble, and something bad is going to happen to you or somebody else. So what happens is, because of the criminal having control of the situation, they make the rules. They are the ones that decide what happens or doesn't happen. So it's important for us to be able to, and I'm getting out of character now, to be able to, you can go off if you want, to be able to engage the audience, to bring them into it. And I'm usually standing right in front of these people. And so as I'm engaging and the person is standing up and we're having this conversation, everyone in the audience is watching, everybody in the audience is becoming a part of the process. They enter into the presentation by doing this. And once again, I'm using stories as a means of conveying my information. So what this does is challenges them. It gets them to understand through sometimes question and answers. Afterwards, I would ask the entire audience something like, how many of you have experienced something like this? Raise your hand. How many of you have seen this type of situation? Those type of interactions really do bring the audience into the situation. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is at the end of presentations, there are often question and answer sessions. In this particular one, we'll have a question and answer session as well. And so what sometimes happens is people will ask a question for which I already have an answer in the form of a story. And I do this because it gives me an opportunity to continue presenting to them a point that I want to get across. So let me give you an example. A typical question that is often asked of me is, how can students get involved in helping to address the modern issue, modern slavery issue in, let's say, North America? And so the answer that I would have is, and I'm going into role model now, a couple of years ago, I was in the United States. I did a presentation to a number of students. And afterwards, about 10 of them came up to me and said, we want to do something to address modern slavery. Do you have an idea? So I said, do you have a department store here in town, like a Walmart? And they said, yes, it's right down the street. I said, okay, what I want you to do is at 1 o'clock, once a day, one of you go into that Walmart, go to the manager, talk to him or her, and say, how do we know that all of these products aren't tainted by modern slavery? What systems and procedures do you have? So on the first day, the first person went in, talked to the manager. The manager said, I don't know. Second day, they went in. Manager said, I don't know. Third day, I don't know. Fourth day, I don't know. Fifth day, he had a piece of paper in his hand and he read it off to the person. Sixth day, he didn't need the paper. He knew what that paper said. He said, this is what we do. This is how we do it. Seventh day, that piece of paper was on the side of the red cash register. Eighth day, the woman who was at the teller knew what it was that their policy was. The point is that students can just engage in a positive way with consumers and retailers to help them to understand that we as consumers care about this particular issue. I'll get out of role play. So what this story allows me to do is to use prepared kind of stories to help the audience to continue understanding a particular point. Now, sometimes when we are interviewed after a talk, we get similar type questions. Now, a lot of people don't like talking to the media because they know that what they say is going to go on record and literally thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people will hear it. And so they get nervous, much more nervous than if they're just in front of a particular audience. But once again, what I do is I use stories as part of getting my points across in order to convey something to the media and to the people who will be watching the media to get these points across. So this is a picture of my dad before he passed away. Before I go to the next section, I just want to emphasize something that my father taught me years ago. My father was a genius. He had to drop out of school when he was in 8th grade because his dad died to support the family. He did that. Years later, he got his GED. He went to community college. And eventually, because he wanted to do something related to meteorology, he contacted MIT, which is one of the better schools in the world. And he says, listen, it's summertime. I want to take 5 courses at MIT over the summer. I live in Los Angeles. I'll drive to Boston, and I really want to do this. MIT said these 2 courses are way too hard. Nobody does more than 1 course. My dad says, well, if I pay for it, will you let me come in? They said, okay, if you want to do it, do it. He drove all the way across the country. He took the course. He aced all of them with A pluses. They gave him a full scholarship. He went on to be a world leader. But the one thing that my father would say to me over and over and over again, and I remember this from the time I was a boy, is that genius is when you're able to take a very complicated topic and translate it into something that an 8th grader can understand or a PhD can benefit. So this is one of the things that I want to pass on as advice. We don't have to be overly sophisticated. We just have to be clear. Our messages have to convey what we're trying to get across in a very simple way. So the next thing I want to talk about quickly is how to get audiences to do things. And so near the end of my talk, I often use a story to convey a particular message. And the message that I'm trying to convey is that all of us have to be a part of helping to address modern slavery. So let me tell the way I would go into this story. So years ago, when I was still living in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to address modern slavery. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of this book writing process, I would go from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Gita. And every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to give my story. But she sat and listened to all of the other stories that were taking place. When I finished at this shelter and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. So I said, great. So Gita sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture and murder and betrayal and disease, everything I had ever heard times 10. I honestly didn't know what to say to this girl. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused and paused. Then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? She said that every day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything around her was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. They're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for not caring enough to allow a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times and eventually get AIDS and will die sometime in the future. Now, I tell this story because Gita inherently understood that the only way we're going to be able to address modern slavery is if we get everyone to care about this issue. So I often say to people, if we could get each person who's listening to do just one thing a year related to this, if 10,000 people or 100,000 people did one thing, it would add up to something quite big. So what are these things? Well, one thing you can do basically is to learn about the issue. Guess what? You just heard my presentation. You learned about it. You did your one thing. You don't have to do anything else. But if you go out and tell 2 other people what you heard, you've done a second and a third thing. So simply sharing information is relevant and important. If you become a volunteer, go to an organization doing this and say you want to help. You can even do it from home these days. It adds up. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw me in a documentary, basically reached out to me and said, I want to help. I said, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance. So I gave her an assignment to collect information on the internet. She was better than my second-year Yale law student at finding things because that was her gift. That's what she was good at. If we can relate our gift to what it is that a person is volunteering on, it makes all the difference. You can donate, you can fundraise. To keep a person in a shelter in Cambodia cost about $2 US. How many times do we go into a store and spend $20? If we skipped one of those things, gave a donation to the right organization, it would make a big difference. So the point I'm making is, here is a sand dune the size of a pyramid. It's a massive, beautiful structure made up of tiny little bits of sand. What I use this for is to demonstrate that even something as tiny as a piece of sand in huge numbers can add up to something big. So if we can get lots of people addressing a particular issue, it adds up. It really does make a difference. A couple of other things that I'll say before I end is, with COVID hitting, there are stories everywhere. There's stories related to our personal feelings, our family situation, our communities, our environments. And so when it comes to storytelling, using current events like COVID and your experience related to this and how you overcame challenges is a really important part of the process. The fact that many of us are going online and having webinars and talks like this is a different way of presenting. And honestly, when I first started doing webinars, I hated it. And the reason is that I wanted to be in front of that audience. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted them to be there with me. But gradually over time, what I realized that that's not going to happen right away. And so you can hear that my presentation style is very animated. I try to instill, crescendos and go high and low and get very passionate, use my hands, even though I'm talking online. And so we need to adjust our style to the situation. The last thing I want to do is to say that there are a lot of people who are very fearful of public speaking. Now, my career was about 35 years. The first 20 years, I had a tremendous fear of public speaking. When I was in third grade, I basically was supposed to hand in an article on Abraham Lincoln. I plagiarized it right out of the encyclopedia. My teacher saw this and wanted to teach me a lesson, so she forced me to stand up and read it. I was too young to read the big words that I had written. She really embarrassed me. And for years, I didn't want to do public speaking. But with the work that I had to do public speaking. And so it was an agonizing process. And so finally what I did is I said, I have to get over this. I'm just going to get up in front of people. I'm going to do it over and over and over again. And eventually what happened is I was able to overcome this. So a lot of us feel self-conscious. We are afraid to kind of get in front of people. We think people are going to judge us. We feel nervousness and we think the nervousness is going to shut our brain down and we're not going to remember things. Or we had past experiences like what I just had. But probably the biggest reason why people are nervous is they don't prepare, they don't practice, they don't work on their speeches. And so to get over these things, preparation is one of the most important things. Another thing is making sure that your presentation is realistic. If you have 60 slides and each slide has 10 points and you have 30 minutes to present, you're not going to get through it. You need to really know your material. I try to encourage people not to memorize or read, but to have a visual like what I use, a particular picture that you look at and you talk about and you tell a story when you can. I also get in front of an audience and I try to look at one or two people and I use them as a means of getting my cues. Are they nodding their head? Are they leaning forward? Are they looking at their cell phone as I talk? This helps me to understand if I am reaching my audience. And I talk to that person in a sense. I'm kind of presenting to them. I don't see the big crowd, I'm talking to them. I'm not afraid to be vulnerable. I'm not afraid to make mistakes. And I understand that that makes me human. And I never apologize. Even if I'm feeling nervous, I won't tell people. I won't say, well, I'm really nervous or anything. You don't have to say that. The audience is there. They're supportive of you. They want you to succeed. They want you to be there. So in summary, start with stories. Personal stories are better. Relate them to your own experience. Go slow on the stories. Pause when you can. Don't think scale will convince. You know, if you're going to talk about a big number, give a face to it. Tell a story related to it. Don't be afraid to show your vulnerability and your failures. Try to interact as much as you can with the audience. Offer a compelling reason to help. Make the donor and the audience the hero, and practice, 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 practice. So with that, I'm done. Thank you very much. And I will hand this over to Indira again.
Thank you so much, Matt. I mean, this is very, very helpful because you gave us a lot of tips that we can start using right after. So thank you so much. Now, as I said at the beginning, we're going to start with our Q&A session. So let me start with the first one. What do I need to do to be a good speaker?
I think like anything else in life, you need to practice. And the thing is that as human beings, we practice every day. Every time we have a conversation where we tell a story, you're practicing. You're trying to get your story across to your friend, your colleague, to the people you're talking to. And as a result of that process, you are already kind of becoming an expert in storytelling. What you just need to do is to understand that that same technique can be applied to the audience that you're trying to get something across to. So depending upon the amount of time that you have, you need to determine where you put 1 story, 2 stories, 3 stories, whatever number you want. I sometimes use, one of my favorite presentations is literally a 1-hour presentation that is 10 consecutive stories that at the end conveys the message that I'm trying to do. So every time there's an opportunity to present, accept that challenge, even if you're afraid, and do it over and over and over, and get people to give you honest feedback. What did they like? What they didn't like? But don't take the feedback personally. Accept what they say in the spirit of helping you to feel it's okay. When you start, you're not going to be as good as 5 years later or 10 years later. But at the beginning, it's a little bit shaky. Don't worry about that. You'll get better and better and better. Everyone who's watching this has the potential to be an amazing public speaker. There's no such thing as somebody who has more skill than anyone else. It's in all of us. We just have to empower that side of ourselves to allow ourselves to basically be the public speaker that we can be.
Okay, great. So I'm going to skip some questions because this one is related with the first one and is related with your answer. Someone is asking about how much time takes to prepare a presentation usually.
If I'm starting from scratch, I'm talking about 5 to 8 hours. And let me explain what I do. Is I start looking for slides and looking for the order of slides. And so my first run, I start looking at it. Then I realize I have to move this slide up to here. But the way I try to do things is to actually have pictures of things that I want to talk about. Now, sometimes you have to use bullets. Sometimes you have to convey detailed information. But if I have to do that, I do a story, I convey some information. I do a story, I convey some information, partly because the conveying of information, you start to lose them a little bit, but the story brings them back. But a lot of people feel like, well, I can just do this in 30 minutes. I'll throw a bunch of things onto a slide. If you spend not enough time, the outcome will be based on the amount of time you put into it. If you put more time into it, you'll get more out of it. But look at it from the standpoint of, I really want this to not only convey messages, but to have the right flow. This point has to go and address this point. The other thing that I do is I will, in front of a mirror, do the presentation. I'll talk out loud. And talking to yourself and doing it is harder than doing it in front of an audience. But it helps me to realize that it's a little bit cumbersome here. I need to change this thing around. But refining and improving and refining and improvement is very much part of that process.
So if I'm understanding correctly, practice is the key to be successful, right?
Everything in life, practice is the key to success. And whether you're doing negotiation with people, whether you're going into a meeting and trying to get a point across, whether you're doing, people don't understand the importance of practicing because we're not encouraged to do that. Who gives that message to us that we need to do that? As a person who, works all over the world with major organizations and so forth, it took me a while to figure this out. But let me just say this. You need to put as much preparation into engagements with people in any circumstance in terms of practicing, thinking about it, writing it down, and that's where success comes, especially with the audiences that you sometimes come in contact with being, competitive, or they don't give you, a certain amount of relevance or importance because maybe you're a woman in a situation where men dominate. Those types of things require preparation.
Okay, so the next question is, how do I use storytelling when I have little time to sell my product or service, especially during networking events where you have little time to explain what you do?
Yeah, actually, the elevator pitch is basically the equivalent of a short story. My elevator pitch is to somebody. My name is Matt Friedman. I'm the CEO of an organization that works with the private sector to help them to address the issue of modern slavery by using their skills and their abilities. And basically, this helps us to apply the kind of expertise that exists, that's so prevalent within the private sector, to addressing a social problem. If you're interested, I'm really happy to help. You understand what it is that you need to know. Let's set up a time to meet. Or, so if you stand up in a meeting and you have 5 minutes, then out of that, you can come up with a story. If it's 10 minutes, perhaps it's a little bit of a story at the beginning and then the points that you want to get across. The idea is, and this is another philosophical approach that I've often used in my career, is I start presentations and workshops and conferences from the standpoint of how do I not bore people? We are easily bored, especially if we give information in a way that doesn't work with our mind. How many times have we been in situations where we bore people to tears? Okay, so anytime you can use a story to convey something, you draw people in, whether you're standing right in front of somebody or whether you have 5 people in a meeting or whether you're doing a public speaking type thing. Try to think of how can I convey that in the form of a story.
Okay, even if you only have like 30 seconds, make it happen.
And then it's an elevator pitch. My name is so-and-so. This is what I do. I really think it's a very effective. Give me an opportunity to meet you. It's kind of like a lot of people, when they're trying to get their first job, they spend a lot of time obsessing about their resume. It's not the resume that's important. It's the resume's ability to get you in front of the people who are going to interview you. The resume is a means to an end. The interview is the desirable endpoint. Don't focus on the resume, focus on the interview. And it's the same type of thing. If you feel like you bumble or you stumble in that particular situation, write down what your elevator pitch is, your summary, and then say it over and over and over, and just get into the habit of just saying it and saying it and saying it. And then eventually it just becomes a part of what you say. I agree, it's hard to kind of get, in 30 seconds a story across. You're just introducing who you are and what you do. But when you eventually get that follow-up, that's when you got to start getting into the stories. And, this is how I get, if you have that interview later, this is how I got into modern slavery. This is my experience. People who tell their experience of why they want to get a job based on a story, 60% of the time have a better chance of getting that job because the story demonstrates their humanity, demonstrates their communication skills, demonstrates the relevance of that job to their particular life.
Great. Well, we have another question. If I have a business where I need to sell my products or services online, how do I take advantage of social media using the storytelling?
Well, from the point at which you had that first idea that you wanted to go into business, then you talked about it, then you managed to get the money, and you got kind of your logo and your business. Through that whole story, there are probably some interesting things that took place. Let's say that it's cosmetics, and I'm just throwing something out there. So you decided that you were going to get involved in cosmetics. You heard that in Sri Lanka there was a organization that had environmentally friendly, type products, and you could have as a story, I buy makeup and I use it, but it never really addresses my needs. And so I heard about this company in Sri Lanka, and I looked into it, and wow, they're doing these amazing things. They use tree bark and a variety of other things, and it's environmentally safe. And at the same time, I've used these products, and as a result of that, I felt really excited about it. And so after that, I decided that I was going to go and tell my friends. And as we got more friends involved in this type of a situation, people said, wow, that's the type of product that's going to make a difference. So because I recognized that people wanted this, I recognized that people really benefited, and it made the world a better place, and it was helping people in villages. In another place, I decided to set up this business. So I feel passionate about this. I really feel, so to do a short 10, 15, 30 second, 60-second talk like that, a little selfie type video that you post, and I recommend that you do it over and over until you get that one that really conveys that message, and put it online. Let people see it. And then, a month later, you put something else similar to that, a different aspect of the story, or a testimony, or something like that. But it's because, a testimony is a story. When somebody says, I buy this product, oh my gosh, it's really great. Before I was doing this, this, and this. By having other people tell your story, you're telling stories. So social networking has the potential to do a lot of things. And a lot of people use it, but a lot of people don't use it necessarily as effectively as they can to reach as many people. Indira put on LinkedIn this particular presentation. I saw it going through a number of networks. It came up at least 6 or 7 times on my LinkedIn. So people who wanted that particular talk were sensitized to it because of what was done on LinkedIn for this to happen.
Yes, and I'm sure they have this question too, related with the last one. So when you are just starting, that you don't have testimonies to share, I think a great idea, because what you said, it will be, to share your own story, making the case about, why you decide to start with the business or something like that?
Yeah, it's when you're out with your friends and and somebody says, Indira, I hear you're starting a new business. What's with that? And you talk to them and you explain the reason why. You're naturally telling a story. Take that story and look at it and refine it, and have that be the justification for why you're doing things. People don't buy products, they buy ideas and concepts, and by you presenting the concept of why you did something is much more important than the product. When for example, Apple sells a phone, they don't go and say, here's the phone. They say, we're going to sell an idea. We're going to sell an idea of a device that allows you to communicate with people, that allows you to have all your information in one place, that allows you to be able to tap into it's not the phone they're selling, it's the concept. And the concepts can be easily transmitted through storytelling.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Are there any topics that I should avoid when telling a story?
You will be able to determine the topics that you don't tell, again, by sharing the story with a small group or your friends. Like in the counter-trafficking world, anti-trafficking world, there are some very sensitive topics. And when my staff comes and says, I want to do a presentation or a talk on this, and I say, okay, be careful with this particular one. And let me tell you the reason why. So much of where you get the refinement of your talk is to talk to people about the story before you give it, and they'll tell you whether it's appropriate or not appropriate. But, you know, I mean, there are times when people tell stories that have no point, or they go on and on and on, and after a while we begin to tune out. Well, I see it a lot here in Asia. You know, it's really important for the story to have a clear message that you're trying to get across, and I try to always focus on the positive. Always try to get out a message of hope, of inspiration, of optimism, of caring, of compassion, of kindness, positiveness during this very difficult period that we are in helps. It helps to sell things. It helps to people to feel good about things. I try not to focus on the negative if I don't have to.
Great, thank you. We have another question. We have many questions, in fact. No, we're almost done. How do you keep the audience engaged when the stories are sad or difficult? Can people shut down?
Good question. So when I was first doing presentations on human trafficking, my assumption was that I need to tell them all of the pain and suffering that exists in the world. So I would do 45 minutes of those stories, and I would have a room like this. They would be zombies. They were so traumatized by what I did is I shut them down. So I realized 45 minutes was too long. So I went from 45 minutes to 30 minutes, still too long. Then I went to 20 minutes, still too long. So now I do about 8.5 minutes of pain and suffering. It's enough to calibrate them to the topic. It's enough to get them interested in the topic of what I'm doing. And then I move on with my talk. So it's important, if you are telling sad stories, to balance the sadness with information in between other stories. And again, at the end of the talk, to offer hope, to offer something positive. You don't want them walking out there feeling depressed. You want them out there saying, wow, there's a big problem. There are people doing things. And as a result of me being a part of that process, I can help this situation and the world can be a better place.
That's very interesting. So, I mean, it is not bad to tell sad stories, but you need to keep short, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you are dealing with a topic that I can't sugarcoat sex trafficking, I can't sugarcoat a 12-year-old girl being commercially raped 5,000 times. It is what it is. It's sad. But if I'm trying to address that issue, I have to tell the story. Sad stories are appropriate, you know, but the point I'm trying to make is that when you continue your talk, you want sadness to be on the bottom, and then by the end, it's replaced by hope. It's a gradual progression of optimism and solutions that are going to make a difference at the end.
Great. And we have the last question. Can you talk a little about the flow of the presentation? Would the presentation should be like a film rhythm?
Are we talking about a story or the overall presentation?
No, I think they're talking about the story.
Okay, the story, it has to have a context where it is. Sometimes it has characters, and it could be just you and your experiences with other people. Sometimes it has a conflict in it related to the same way we see stories on television. And so there's this kind of movement or progression over time that results in an endpoint. So I can't emphasize this enough. And I've said it 3 times. I'm going to say it one more time. Write the story down that you want to tell. Look at it, edit it, re-edit it, re-edit it, re-edit it, and then read it out to see how much time it is. If it's more than 3 minutes, I think initially 3 minutes, then try to cut it down. But make sure that the points that you have in there are relevant. Sometimes, you know, somebody's trying to tell a story and they keep saying, oh, I forgot to mention this, and oh, and then there was this factor. There's a lot of that that's just not needed. So you have various elements that you're trying to convey as part of the process to get the story across. Cut out anything that's extraneous, that's not necessary, and just focus on, I want to tell the story to get a message across. Okay. And, you know, I will say that if you're a business person and you're starting off, you haven't started off, you are going to have a significant advantage if you're able to reach people through this technique over people who just say, I have a product, and then they list all of the things that make the product good. You can take the reason why the product is good and put it into a story and relate it to a human being or a situation. People will listen to that a lot more than just the straight, it's good because it's cheap and it's, it's as good as other products, et cetera, et cetera. You're not selling the product, you're selling an idea. You're selling who you are and your concept. And that's what people will buy.
That's very useful. I mean, you're not selling a product, but you're selling an idea. I mean, I think we need to keep that in mind. So we're done. Again, thank you so much. I have some comments from the audience that I would like to share with you. They are very grateful, excellent ideas to deliver, accurate information. Thank you. Interesting, helpful, and empowering presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Very useful tips and great stories.
Well, thank you from the audience. I'm glad that I had an opportunity to present this. I have a couple of books out if you're interested. One is called Be the Hero, Be the Change. You can get it at Amazon. It's not in Spanish now, it's in English. Another book is called Where Were You? And it talks about my experiences related to modern slavery. What's interesting about that book is about half the book talks about basically my failures and the things that I did that were super embarrassing or I messed up or whatever. And I use it because many of our failures are opportunities to learn from. And, the last thing that I'll say just in closing is when I worked for the United Nations, when a new staff member came in, I said, I expect you to fail 3 times this year. Please go out and fail, because really it's important for us to go a little bit beyond our comfort level and not do things to be risk averse. Like, I'm afraid if I do it, something bad may happen. If you don't test the boundaries, if you don't go over the line, your business isn't going to succeed as much. And so it's really important to just try things. And if it doesn't work, okay, I'll regroup and I'll try again and I'll try again. Be persistent. Know that the end point is going to be that your product or your business is going to succeed. Have that locked in your mind. Don't let failure get in the way, and just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And that's how you're really going to succeed.
Thank you so much. Now I'll switch to Spanish to thank you, the audience, and also to tell them that if they are interested in reading any of your books, they can always send us a message and we will be more than happy to share the names. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sounds good. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Matt. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias por habernos acompañado el día de hoy. Creo que nos quedamos con tips súper concretos que de ahora en adelante nos van a servir muchísimo, ¿no? Y uno de ellos es la práctica, práctica y práctica. Otro de ellos que me encanta es que no vendemos productos, vendemos ideas, y eso hay que aplicarlo en todo momento. Y el último que nos cuenta, que creo que también es súper bueno, porque a veces estamos acostumbrados o pensamos que si nos equivocamos ya está mal, todo se cayó, se echó a perder, y es todo lo contrario. Tenemos que equivocarnos para aprender y así poder ser mejores. Entonces, bueno, muchísimas gracias, Matt. Estamos felices y súper agradecidas de que hayas tenido esta charla tan interesante y tan útil con nosotras y con toda la audiencia, que seguramente también están encantados. Cualquier pregunta, cualquier duda que les surja, nos pueden enviar un correo con toda la confianza a info@alicenempowerland.com, y con gusto nosotros contactamos a Matt y él estará encantado de responder cualquier duda que haya quedado. Muchísimas gracias de nuevo y esperamos verlos pronto. Gracias y buenas noches.
Bye-bye.
Bye.